When Eleanor Stanton's only milk cow vanished into the frozen Montana mist, it seemed like the last thread holding her family together had finally snapped. Hunted by debt, threatened by a ruthless banker, and judged by a town that believed a widow could not stand alone, Ellie was nearly out of hope, until a quiet drifter named Silas Vance returned what had been stolen and chose to stay. This is a Western story about dignity, redemption, and the truth that love is not rescue. It is the daily choice to stand beside someone through the storm. If this story touches your heart, please like, comment, share it with someone who believes in courage, and subscribe for more powerful frontier tales.
The rusty hinge of the barn door didn't just creak, it wailed. It was a sharp metal screech that cut through the frozen 5 o'clock mist and took a piece of Eleanor Stanton's chest along with it. Ellie froze in the middle of the yard. The wooden bucket in her right hand was empty, its iron bands biting cold into her calloused palm. Her breath blossomed into a small, ragged cloud of white. The door was swinging wide, loose, slapping against the weathered pine siding of the barn. Inside, where Daisy should have been shifting her weight and lowing for her morning grain, there was only the hollow gray of autumn shadows, the smell of old straw, cold manure, empty space. Ellie didn't drop the bucket out here. You didn't drop things just because your heart stopped beating. Held on. If you let go of the bucket, you had to bend down to pick it up, and right now her knees weren't sure they could manage the return trip. "Mama?" Caleb's voice came from the back porch. He was 14, his coat already too short in the wrists, standing with an unlit lantern. "Stay there, Caleb," she called out. Her voice sounded thin to her own ears, like paper pulled too tight. "Keep your sister inside." She walked toward the barn. Every step felt like wading through knee-deep river mud, though the ground was frozen solid as anvil iron. She stepped into the stall. The floor was still warm where the great red-brindled cow had slept. The halter rope hadn't snapped. It had been sliced clean with a sharp knife. Daisy was gone. The math started in her head before she could even stop it. And sick it she'd caught the day her husband William died 8 months ago. Every breath she took now had a price tag attached. Without Daisy, there was no cream to churn. Without the cream, there was no butter to trade at the mercantile mister. Thorne's Bank didn't take promises for breakfast, and they certainly wouldn't take them come Christmas. When the $340 note on the valley pasture came due, no hope left. The phrase didn't come with tears. It came with a cold, heavy grayness that settled behind her eyes. By noon, the mist had burned off, leaving the Montana sky a hard, unblinking blue. Ellie sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the grain of the scrubbed pine. Reverend Miller sat opposite her. He'd come under the guise of Christian charity, bringing a jar of preserves his wife had put up. He hadn't touched his tea. "Sign, Eleanor," the Reverend said, his voice dripping with the heavy practiced sorrow. "A woman alone at sand, like a house built upon the sand. The territory is a cruel place for a withholdster and its reasonable man. He's prepared to buy the acreage for enough to clear your debt, and he has a room for you and the children at the boarding house in town." Ellie looked at the jar of preserves. She stood up, her spine straightening, one vertebra at a time. She walked to the stove, took the heavy iron kettle, and poured a stream of boiling water into the sink. She didn't look at him. She kept her back turned, her posture rigid as a fence post. "The boarding house," Ellie said, her voice quiet. "Where Clara Jenkins lives now. A safe place for a woman," Miller said. Ellie turned around, leaning her hands against the edge of the dry sink. She didn't sit back down. She stood over him, making him look up. "Clara Jenkins used to own 90 acres, the finest bottomland in the valley," Ellie said. Each word was a chipped flint. "Now she scrubs Mr. Thorne's linoleum floors until her knuckles bleed, just to keep a roof over her head that isn't hers. You call that safety, Reverend? I call it the reality of our world, Eleanor. A woman cannot sign a line of credit. She cannot vote on the town council. The law is a wall you cannot climb alone." Ellie walked to the door and held it open. The wind came in, smelling of pine needles and coming winter. "Then I live at the bottom of the wall," Ellie said. "A person's worth isn't measured by the ledger in Harrison Thorne's bank, Reverend. And it surely isn't measured by how quickly a woman gives up her dignity just because the road gets steep." "Oh, Mr. Thorne, I'm still standing on my own dirt." The minister stood, his face darkening. He adjusted his hat. "Pride goeth before destruction, Mrs. Stanton." "No," Ellie said, looking out at the sweeping valley. "Pride is what you have when you're empty." Dignity is what keeps you from letting another man decide if your children get to keep their father's name on the gate. Good day. The sun went down behind the peaks, throwing long blue shadows across the prairie. Ellie sat by the single tallow candle. The ledger book open before her. The ink lines were black ink on yellowed paper, but to her, they looked like iron bars. Butter trade 2.50 a week gone. Winter flour 6.00 needed. Note 340.00 unpaid. The numbers didn't move. They didn't care that William was buried under the cottonwood tree by the creek. They didn't care that Lily needed new boots, because the soles of her old ones were held together with large soaked rag string. She looked at her hands. They were red. The skin split around the knuckles. In the drawer beneath the ledger lay a small, black leather case. Inside were 3 silver needles, a spool of silk thread, and a bottle of carbolic acid. She hadn't touched them in years. Dr. Harmon had told her once, back in Illinois, "You have the hands for it, Ellie." Better than most men who call themselves surgeons. But Dr. Harmon was dead, and the Territory Board didn't license women, and a surgeon's needle couldn't buy a milk cow. Leaned her forehead against the cool pine of the table. The candle sputtered. For the first time since the winter frost had claimed William, Ellie closed her eyes and let the dark take her. There was no light at the end of the valley. There was only the cold, the debt, and the empty stall in the barn. She had reached the end of her rope, and the knot she tied at the bottom was slipping. The frost was heavy, brittle. It turned the prairie grass to spun glass that shattered under a boot heel. Caleb was at the chopping block. He swung the axe. It bit into the pine log off-center, twisting his wrists. The boy muttered a curse. He wiped his nose on his sleeve. Raised the axe again. He was trying too hard to be a man, working from anger instead of rhythm. Then the front gate groaned. Caleb froze. He let the axe head drop to the dirt. A man stood at the edge of the yard, tall, broad across the chest, a canvas duster stained with trail dust and dried mud, his shoulders slumped just a fraction, like a man carrying a heavy sack he couldn't figure out how to set down. In his right hand, he held a frayed piece of hemp rope. At the end of the rope was Daisy. Al chewed on nothing, blowing steam from her wet nose, oblivious to the fact she was the difference between a family surviving the winter or freezing in it. The porch door opened. Ellie stepped out. She didn't have her shawl. She didn't feel the cold. She walked down the steps, slow, wary. Her eyes moved from the cow to the man. He looked to be in his mid-40s. A small scar cut through the stubble on his left jaw. His eyes were dark brown. They didn't linger. They scanned the yard, the tree line, the barn, and finally settled on the ground near Ellis' boots. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was making sure one wasn't waiting for him. "She has your brand," the man said. His voice was gravel, low, used to the quiet. Cowboy on the left flank found her moving west with a few steers. Ellie stopped 10 feet away. She crossed her arms. "You found her." 3 men were pushing them hard night riding. Ellie knew what night riding meant. Rustlers, desperate men, dangerous men. Looked at the man's hip. A Colt revolver sat in a worn leather holster. The leather was supple, well-oiled, but the gun didn't look like it had been fired. 3 men, Ellie said. Her voice was flat. "Are you hurt?" The man blinked. He looked up, actually. Looked at her this time. Nobody ever asked the man with the gun if he was hurt first. They asked about the property, or the thieves. "No, ma'am." "Did you shoot them?" "No." 2 were hired hands. Looked easy. The third was a man named Bean Boone. He decided a milk cow wasn't worth a bleeding hole in his chest. They rode off. He held out the rope. Caleb stepped forward, taking it. The boy looked at the man with wide eyes, then led Daisy toward the barn. "I don't have money to pay you," Ellie said. It hurt to say it. It tasted like ash, but she wouldn't lie. "The bank has the deed. The cow is the only cash this farm makes. If you want a reward, I can give you 2 jars of preserves and half a sack of oats." The man shook his head. "Didn't ask for a reward. Nobody crosses 3 armed rustlers in the dark for nothing." The man hooked his thumbs into his gun belt. He picked up, whipping the hem of his duster. "Out here, stealing a milk cow in the night isn't just property theft, ma'am," he said. His voice carried clear and steady. "It's taking food from children's mouths. It's stealing tomorrow. People think a man has to be a hero to step in. He doesn't. Kindness doesn't need a grand reason. It just requires a man to decide not to look away when the world goes wrong." Ellie stood perfectly still. The words landed hard. In Oakhaven, men spoke of law. They spoke of property. They didn't speak of kindness as a duty. "My name is Eleanor Stanton," she said. "Silas Vance. Have you eaten, Mr. Vance?" "Not since yesterday noon. Coffee is on the stove." Biscuits are cold, but they'll fill a gap. She turned and walked back to the house. She didn't look back to see if he followed. It was an invitation, not a command. He followed. Breakfast was quiet. Silas ate exactly what was put in front of him. He didn't take extra. He didn't talk with his mouth full. Lily, sitting across from him, stared with big, unblinking eyes. "You look like a cowboy," the 8-year-old said. "But you don't smell like whiskey." "Lily," Ellie warned softly. Silas didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "Don't drink whiskey, little miss. It makes a man's hands shake, and my hands need to be steady." After he ate, Silas thanked her. He stood up, picked up his hat, and walked out the door. Ellie watched from the kitchen window. She expected him to mount his roan gelding and ride out. The debt of the universe was paid. He had his meal, but Silas didn't go to his horse. He walked over to the north fence line. The posts had rotted near the creek. The barbed wire was sagging, useless against a determined coyote, let alone a straying herd. Silas set his hat on a stump. He found the post-hole digger leaning against the barn. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't negotiate a wage. He just drove the iron blades into the frozen dirt, lifted, dropped, lifted. Ellie watched him from the glass. Her chest felt tight, not with panic, with something else, something she hadn't felt since the ground thawed enough to bury William. It was the sight of someone mending what was broken, without being begged, without holding it over her head. Hope, and it terrified her. By dusk, Silas had reset 6 posts. The wire was pulled taut. It hummed in the wind like a guitar string. He was at the water trough, washing the mud and sweat from his hands when Ellie walked out. She carried a lantern. The yellow light cut through the evening blue. Silas dried his hands on a rag. He waited. "You do good work, Mr. Vance," she said. "Dirt's soft near the creek. Wire was tangled, but salvageable. You planning to ride on tomorrow?" Silas looked out toward the horizon. Mountains were black teeth against a purple sky. The road always goes somewhere. Ellie took a breath. She had done the math. She had fought with her pride all afternoon. Pride was a warm coat, but it didn't buy flour. "I have 120 acres. Ellie said. Her voice was steady. "Business. I have 9 weeks before the bank takes it. The roof on the barn leaks. The winter wheat needs harvesting before the snow sticks, and the rest of that fence will fall if a strong wind hits it." Silas didn't interrupt. He listened. "If you stay," Ellie continued, "I will pay you $2 a day. 3 meals. You eat at our table, not on the porch. You sleep in the tack shed out back. I'll clear it out and put a stove in there." Silas turned his head. $2 is fair, but folks around here might talk a widow taking and drift the word bird travels." "Let them talk," Ellie said. She stepped closer. The lantern light caught the steel in her gray eyes. "This town thinks a woman without a husband is a child who needs a master. I don't need a master. I need a hired hand. We stand equal on this dirt, mister. You give your sweat, I give my silver. Neither of us owes the other soul. You keep your boundaries, and I will keep mine." Silas looked at her. Really looked at her. He had seen generals in the war with less command in their spine. He had seen men break over a fraction of what this woman was carrying. "I don't mind the work, Mrs. Stanton. But you should know, not a man looking to settle. I carry ghosts." "I don't care about your ghosts," Ellie said flatly. "I care if you can swing a scythe." He nodded. "Once." "Oh, then we have a deal." "We do." Ellie turned. "Breakfast is at 5. Don't be late." Word did travel. Oakhaven was a small town, and secrets had a way of leaking through the floorboards. By Tuesday, Sheriff Amos Dalton rode his gray mare past the Stanton farm. He didn't stop. He just slowed to a walk. Dalton was a man who preferred peace to justice. Justice took work. Peace just required looking the other way when Harrison Thorne wanted a piece of land. Silas was on the barn roof, nail-lifting cedar shingles. He paused. Holding the hammer, Dalton looked up. Eyes caught the leather holster slung over the porch railing. He saw the silver star carved into the leather, a Texas Ranger mark. Dalton tipped his hat, a silent. "I see you." Silas went back to hammering. "I see you too." That night, the wind howled. It rattled the window panes of the farmhouse. Caleb couldn't sleep. The boy felt a strange mix of relief and resentment. He was glad the fence was fixed, but he hated that another man had fixed it. He made him feel small, useless. He pulled on his boots and slipped out the back door. The cold bit his cheeks. He crept toward the tack shed. A thin slice of yellow light spilled from beneath the door. Caleb crouched, peering through a crack in the warped pine boards. He expected to see Silas Vance oiling his gun, or drinking from a flask. That was what men did in the Penny Dreadfuls. That was what the cowboys in town did when the work was done. But Silas wasn't holding a gun. He was sitting on a wooden crate next to a small iron stove. In his hands was a book, all bound in worn leather. Silas lipped slightly as he read. The man looked peaceful, not violent, not angry, just quiet. Caleb squinted, trying to read the gold lettering on the spine. Meditations, Marcus Aurelius. Caleb didn't know the name, but he knew what it meant. A man didn't have to be a brute to be strong. Strength wasn't just calluses and gunpowder. Strength was sitting quiet in a cold shed, reading the thoughts of dead men, trying to figure out how to live right in a world that was mostly wrong. Caleb backed away from the shed, careful not to make a sound. He walked back to the house. His chest felt lighter. Inside the shed, Silas turned a page. The fire crackled. For the first time in 2 years, he didn't dream of the boy in Abilene. He just slept. The wheat stood chest-high, gold dry, ready. The wind moved across the field like a giant hand brushing over velvet. It looked soft from a distance. Close, the stalks were stiff. The chaff scratched at the skin. It was hard, unforgiving work. They started at dawn. The sky was the color of a bruised peach, slowly bleeding into a bright, blinding blue. Silas swung the scythe, a long, smooth arc. Swish, crack. The wheat fell in neat rows. He stepped forward, swung again, swish, crack. Breathing found a rhythm, a metronome of labor. Ellie worked to his left. She didn't use a long scythe. She used a hand sickle, gathering the fallen stalks, binding them into sheaves. Caleb worked behind them, stacking the sheaves into shocks. For the first 3 hours, the only sounds were the blades cutting the stalks and the dry rustle of the crop. By 9 o'clock, the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The heat dropped on them like a wool blanket. The air grew thick with dust. It coated their throats. It stung their eyes. Didn't stop. She bent, scooped, tied, lifted over and over. But bodies have memories. Muscles remember the cold. They remember the breaks. Last winter, when William was dying, Ellie had to haul firewood alone in a blizzard. She slipped on the ice, tore something deep in her right shoulder. A doctor in Helena could have fixed it. A widow in Oakhaven just had to wrap it tight and pretend it didn't hurt. By 10 o'clock, the pretending stopped working. A sharp, hot spike of pain drove itself deep into her rotator cuff. Her breath hitched. The sickle slipped from her grip, burying its point in the dirt. Ellie bit the inside of her cheek hard. She tasted copper. She didn't cry out. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the white-hot flash of agony to recede into a dull, throbbing ache. Silas was 10 feet away. He didn't turn his head. He didn't break his rhythm. Swish, crack. But Silas was a man who survived by reading the space around him. You don't live 12 years wearing a ranger star by ignoring the quiet things. He heard the sudden break in the rustling wheat. The sharp intake of breath. He glanced over. Just a fraction. He saw Ellie leaning heavy on her left leg. Her right arm hung stiff at her side. Her jaw was locked tight. She was trying to bend down to retrieve the sickle, but her shoulder wouldn't yield. Any other man might have walked over, might have told her to sit down, might have offered to fetch water, or worse, told her to go inside and rest. Silas knew better. He knew pride was a fragile thing. When a person has lost their husband, their money, and their security, pride is the last wall standing. You don't kick down a person's wall just to show them you can help. True compassion wasn't loud. It wasn't a show. It was stepping into the gap without demanding a thank you. Silas adjusted his grip on the scythe handle. He shifted his footing. Instead of cutting a straight path, he widened his arc. He took a half step to the left. Swish, crack, he swept through his lane. Then he swept through the edge of hers. He moved faster. The muscles in his back coiled and released. Sweat poured down his face, cutting tracks through the yellow dust. Look at her. He just worked like a machine, leaving a clean, wide path of fallen wheat that required less reaching, less bending. Ellie picked up her sickle with her left hand. She switched her grip. It was awkward, clumsy. But when she moved to gather the next bundle, she realized the stalks were already piled closer together. The heavy lifting was done. She paused. She looked at Silas. He was yards ahead, now, his broad back rising and falling with the effort. He was doing the work of 2 men, searing his own lungs so she wouldn't have to humiliate herself by quitting. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The gratitude settled deep in her chest, warm and solid. By noon, the sun was a hammer. "Water break," Silas called out. His voice was raspy. They gathered under the shade of the lone cottonwood tree at the edge of the field. Lily came running from the porch, carrying a tin bucket sloshing with well water and a wooden dipper. Caleb drank first, gulping greedily. Then he collapsed in the grass. His chest heaving, Silas took the dipper. He drank slow, measured. He handed it to Ellie. Fingers brushed against the tin. His hands were calloused, rough as sandstone. Hers were blistered. She looked up at him from under the brim of her straw hat. The shadow of the leaves dappled his face. "You cut a wide lane today, Mr. Vance," she said softly. "Wheat grows thick on that side." Blade just caught the momentum. It was a lie, a polite, face-saving lie. Ellie took a sip of the cold water. It tasted sweet. Momentum. "Yes, ma'am. Well, I appreciate the momentum. It kept the pace." Silas tipped his hat. He sat down against the trunk of the tree, stretching his long legs out. He closed his eyes. Lily walked over and sat right next to Silas. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. He didn't yell. He didn't act bigger than he was. He was just quiet, Mr. Silas, Lily asked, tracing a circle in the dust. "Why do you work so hard for us? We ain't kin." Caleb hissed. "Lily, hush." Silas opened one eye, looked at the little girl. "A man works hard because the work needs doing, Lily. Family is blood, but community is sweat. You don't have to share a last name to share a burden." He closed his eyes again. Ellie leaned her head back against the bark. She watched the wind ripple the remaining wheat. For the first time in nearly a year, she didn't feel completely alone. The weight of the farm was still there, but the yoke felt a little lighter, because someone else was pulling on the other side. That evening, Ellie sat at the kitchen table. She counted out $14 from the tin box, 2 weeks' wages. Silas walked in from the wash basin. His hair was damp, his shirt was clean, though threadbare at the elbows. Ellie slid the money across the table. Silas looked at the coins. He picked up $4, 2 silver pieces. He slid the remaining 10 back across the wood. "We agreed on $2 a day," Ellie said, her brow furrowed. "We agreed on the fence, the roof, and the harvest," Silas replied. He remained standing. "I spent the last 2 evenings fixing the axle on your buckboard, and I patched the leather traces on the harness. It was my choice, not your order. I don't take pay for chores. I invent a laborer is worthy of his hire, Silas, and a man is worthy of his own conscience. Keep the 10, use it for flour." He didn't wait for an argument. He turned and walked out the back door. Heading for the shed, Ellie stared at the silver on the table. In a world of men who took everything they could reach, a man who refused to take what he had earned was a baffling thing. She picked up the coins. They were warm. She walked over to the window and watched the glow of the lantern flicker to life in the tack shed. Trouble rarely arrived on a dark horse. Mostly it came in a polished buggy. It was Tuesday morning. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn day that made you glad to be breathing. Then the carriage rolled up the driveway. It was a black rig, red-spoked wheels, drawn by a matched pair of bays that cost more than Elias' entire farm. Harrison Thorne held the reins. He wore a dark wool suit, a silver pocket watch chain draped across his vest, and a bowler hat. He didn't look like a cattle baron. He looked like a banker, which was worse. A cattleman might shoot you. A banker would let you starve, legally. Beside him sat Elias Reed, a lawyer from Helena. Tall, sharp man who looked like a ferret in a high collar. Ellie was on the porch shaking out a rug. She stopped. The dust settled around her boots. Silas was by the barn, shoeing the roan, gelding. He heard the carriage. He didn't drop the horse's hoof. He finished driving the nail, clipped the end, and rasped it smooth. Only then did he set the hoof down and turn around. He didn't walk toward the house. He leaned against the corral fence, watching. Thorne tied the reins to the hitching post. He stepped down. Smiled. It was a smile that never reached his eyes. It was purely an exercise of the facial muscles. "Good morning, Eleanor," Thorne said. Height didn't use her given name. It was a subtle demotion, a reminder of power. "Mr. Thorne," Ellie replied. She stayed on the porch. The elevation gave her a foot of height on him. "I don't recall inviting you." "A neighborly visit doesn't require an invitation," Thorne said smoothly. He gestured to the lawyer. "It's Mr. Reed. He represents the Toreto Land Office." Reed tipped his hat. "Mrs. Stanton." Ellie crossed her arms. "The banknote isn't due until December 15th. You're early." Thorne chuckled. A dry, rasping sound. "This isn't about the note." Eleanor, not entirely. "Mr. Reed has been reviewing the county maps, preparing for the winter assessments. It seems there was an error in the original survey of this valley." In 69 Point, Ellie felt the cold creep up her spine, but she kept her face blank in error. "Yes," Reed said, pulling a rolled parchment from his leather satchel. "The boundary line marking the western edge of your property, the line that includes the Sweetwater Creek, was drawn 100 yards too far to the left. The creek, legally speaking, falls on Mr. Thorne's adjacent pasture." It was a lie, a bold, breathtaking lie. The creek was the only year-round water source on the property. Without it, the land was useless for cattle, useless for farming. My husband bought this land with the creek included, Ellie said. Her voice was ice. William was a good man. But he was a farmer, not a surveyor, Thorne said. His tone was infuriatingly gentle. Patronizing, he made an honest mistake. Now normally the territory would just seize the disputed acreage, but a reasonable man I known. 2 children. Too much a burden. It's too much a burden. Thornton took a step closer to the porch stairs. Sell me the farm. Eleanor, I'll give you $300 cash. You can take the children to Helena, start a dress shop, live a quiet, respectable life among other women. Frontier, it requires a strong hand, and nature abhors a vacuum, and a farm without a patriarch is just waiting to be swallowed up. There it was, the ugly truth wrapped in polite concern. Silas pushed off the corral fence. He took 2 slow steps forward. His right hand brushed past the leather of his holster, just a graze, but Reed saw it. The lawyer swallowed hard and took a half step behind Thorne, but Silas didn't intervene. He didn't speak. He watched Ellie. She didn't need a savior. She needed the room to swing her own axe. Ellie gripped the porch rail. Her knuckles went white. A patriarch, Ellie repeated. The word tasted foul in her mouth. It's just the way of the world, Thorne said, spreading his hands. Ellie descended 1 step, then another, until she was on the dirt face to face with Harrison Thorne. The world is whatever we allow it to be, Mr. Thorne, Ellie said. Her voice rang out, sharp and clear like a church bell in the frost. You stand on my dirt and tell me my gender makes me unfit to hold it. Educate you, Thorne, his polite smile faltered. This soil, Ellie pointed a trembling finger at the ground, doesn't recognize the gender of the hands that plow it. The wheat doesn't ask if I wear a skirt or trousers before it decides to grow. I pulled stones from that field until my fingernails bled. I sat up through 3 blizzards keeping those calves alive when my husband was too sick to stand. She took a step closer. Thorne actually leaned back. You use the law as a weapon because you don't have the courage to just hold me up at gunpoint. You think because I don't have a man in my bed to sign a piece of paper, easy prey, but I hold this farm by a deed, signed by the governor of this territory. A deed that includes the creek. That deed is based on a flawed map. Reed squeaked from behind Thorne. Then bring the sheriff, Ellie snapped, her eyes blazing. Bring the territorial marshals. Bring a judge. But until a court of law tells me to move, this is my property. Next time you drive that rig onto my land without an invitation, I will introduce you to the business end of my late husband's Fetchwinster. Do we understand each other? Silence dropped over the yard, heavy, complete. Thorne stared at her. The mask of the polite banker was gone. Eyes were flat, black, and reptilian. You are making a grave mistake, Mrs. Stanton. Pride is a poor substitute for survival. I'll take my chances. Get off my land. Thorne adjusted his bowler hat. He turned sharply. Let's go, Reed. They climbed into the buggy. Thorne whipped the reins hard, taking his frustration out on the horses. He spun around, kicking up a cloud of dry dirt, and rattled down the driveway. Ellie stood in the yard until the dust settled. She was shaking. Adrenaline flooded her veins, leaving her lightheaded. She turned around. Silas was standing near the porch. He held his hat in his hands. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it was going to be all right. He didn't treat her like a damsel who had just survived a fright. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated respect. You handled him, Silas said quietly. For now, Ellie said, rubbing her temples, he'll be back. Find a judge he can buy. I need to find William's original copy of the survey map, the one filed before 69. It has the seal on it. Where is it in William's lockbox? Ellie looked toward the tack shed. It's buried under the floorboards in your shed. I haven't been able to open that box since he passed. Silas nodded. He understood. Some boxes held paper, some held ghosts. I'll dig it up, Silas said. I'll set it on the kitchen table. You open it when you're ready. Thank you, Silas. I didn't do anything. Ellie, he used her name, not to diminish her like Thorne had. Acknowledge her. You fought your own war today, and you won. The soil bull doesn't care who plows it. That was the truest thing spoken in this valley all year. Silas put his hat back on and walked toward the shed to find the lockbox. Ellie stood alone in the sun. She had drawn a line in the sand. She had spoken truth to power. The consequences would come. The storm was brewing, but as she looked out over her fields, the fear was gone, replaced by the cold, hard resolve of a woman who had finally remembered her own strength. The wood was green. Green wood doesn't split. Here's. Caleb was by the woodpile. The morning air was thin, hot, and sharp. He had been out there for an hour, trying to quarter a stubborn length of green ash. He was tired. His shoulders ached, but Silas was fixing the roof, and Caleb felt the burning need to prove he carried his weight. He swung the axe high. He brought it down hard, too hard. He tried to force the split. The heavy iron head struck a knot in the wood. It bounced. It glanced off the bark. Momentum carried the blade down, swinging in a wild, uncontrolled arc toward his left leg. Thwack! It was a loud sound. It was dull, heavy, the sound of metal parting denim and meat. Caleb dropped the axe handle. He stood perfectly still for 1 second. 2. Then he looked down. His pant split leg was torn just below the knee. The blue denim was already turning black. Dark, hot blood welled up, spilling over his leather boot. "Ma!" Caleb screamed. It wasn't the voice of the man of the house. It was the terrified shriek of a 14-year-old boy. Silas was on the barn roof. He heard the scream. He dropped his hammer. He didn't climb down the ladder. He jumped the last 8 feet. Hitting the dirt and rolling, he was up in a flash, sprinting toward the woodpile. 12 years as a ranger. He had seen bullet holes, knife wounds, arrow strikes. His brain shifted instantly into the cold, calculated gear of survival. He reached Caleb just as the boy's knees buckled. Silas caught him, lowered him to the dirt. He ripped his own bandana from his neck, ready to tie off the limb. He opened his mouth to shout for Ellie to bring boiling water and whiskey, but the screen door banged open. Ellie didn't run like a panicked mother. She moved with terrifying speed, but zero waste. She held a black leather case in one hand and a bottle of clear liquid in the other. "Hold his shoulders down, Silas," she ordered. It wasn't a request. It was the bark of a commanding officer. Silas obeyed instantly. He pinned the thrashing boy to the ground. Ellie dropped to her knees in the dirt. She didn't weep. She didn't hesitate. Ripped Caleb's pant leg up to the thigh, exposing the wound. It was deep, a clean slice through the muscle, bleeding fast. "Look at me, Caleb," Ellie said. Her voice was suddenly low, calm, hypnotic. "Look right at my eyes. Breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth." She handed Silas a strip of clean linen she had pulled from her apron. "Tie it above the knee, tight, twist it with this stick." Silas applied the tourniquet. The flow of blood slowed. Ellie opened the leather case. Inside lay 3 curved silver needles and a spool of black silk thread. Stared dead, and I didn't find silk surgical thread in a farmhouse sewing kit. She poured the clear liquid over her own hands. It smelled sharp, chemical, carbolic acid. She poured the rest directly into the wound. Caleb howled, arching his back. Silas held him steady. "I know, baby, I know," Ellie murmured, but her hands never shook. Not a millimeter. Threaded the needle. She pinched the edges of the severed muscle together. She didn't just stitch the skin. She worked deep, layer by layer. Silas watched, mesmerized. Her fingers moved with the practiced rhythmic grace of a master craftsman. Pull, tie. Snips. Silas had seen army doctors work slower and sloppier. 10 minutes later, the wound was closed. A neat, perfectly spaced row of black stitches held Caleb's leg together. Bleeding had stopped. The boy had passed out from the pain and the shock. Ellie sat back on her heels. She exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The commanding officer vanished, leaving a pale, trembling mother in the dirt. Silas scooped the unconscious boy into his arms. "I'll carry him to his bed." Ellie nodded, gathering her instruments. An hour later, the house was quiet. Caleb was asleep, dosed with a few drops of laudanum Ellie kept in the cupboard. Lily was sitting by his bed reading to him softly, even though he couldn't hear her. Silas stood at the kitchen sink. He was pumping water over his bloody hands. Ellie sat at the table. The black leather case was open before her, carefully wiping the silver needles with alcohol. Silas dried his hands on a towel. He turned and leaned against the counter. He looked at her. He didn't ask if she was a doctor. He asked the only question that made sense. "Where did you learn to do that?" Ellie didn't look up immediately. "She polished the needle until it shined. St. Louis," she said quietly. "Then Illinois. Before I met William, you didn't just learn to sew up a cut. You knew the muscle layers. You used carbolic acid. Town sawbones still think washing their hands is a waste of time." Ellie placed the needle back in the velvet-lined slot. "I apprenticed under Dr. Thomas Harmon. For 4 years, I didn't just empty bedpans. Silas, I studied anatomy. I assisted in amputations. I delivered breech babies. Harmon told me I had the quietest hands he'd ever seen." Silas crossed his arms. "Then why are you milking cows in Oakhaven?" Ellie closed the case. The snap of the brass latch sounded like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. She looked up at him. Her gray eyes were hard, full of an old calcified anger. "I applied to the medical board for my license," she said. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of 100 arguments she had lost before she even opened her mouth. "I passed the written exams. I had Dr. Harmon's highest recommendation. But the board was made up of 6 men in wool suits who believed a woman's brain was too fragile for the rigors of science. Silas didn't speak, he just listened. He knew when a truth needed room to breathe. They told me it was improper, Ellie continued. The words cutting like glass, they said. Seeing the male form would ruin my delicate sensibilities. Then when I proved I already had, they changed their tune. By then, William and I were courting. I was pregnant with Caleb. She stood up. She walked to the window, looking out at the woodpile where her son's blood was still soaking into the dirt. The board denied my license on moral grounds, she said. They said a woman with a child has a divine duty to the home, that a mother cannot possibly serve 2 masters, the clinic and the cradle. They weaponized my motherhood, Silas. They used my own child as an excuse to strip me of my capability. They decided that because I could give life, I wasn't allowed to save it. Silas looked at the floor. The injustice of it was a bitter pill. Out here, talent was survival, wasting it was a sin. So you buried it, Silas said. William was moving west. He wanted land, I wanted a family, so I packed my medical books in the bottom of a trunk, and I learned to bake bread. I don't resent my husband. I don't met your children. I love them fiercely. She turned back to face him. But I resent the men who looked at my hands, saw what they could do, and told me to fold them in my lap. Silas walked over to the table. He didn't offer her pity. Pity was an insult to a woman like Ellie. He stopped 2 feet away from her. Those men were fools, Silas said. His voice was low, absolute. I've ridden with the best surgeons the army had to offer. None of them could have saved that boy's leg as clean as you did today. You are a doctor, Ellie. Paper or no paper. Ellie stared at him. Her throat tightened. She had carried the shame of her rejection for 15 years. She had buried her ambition so deep she thought it was dead. But hearing this drifter, this quiet, dangerous man, speak the truth she had been denied, it broke something open inside her. Thank you, Silas, it was a whisper. Silas touched the brim of his hat. He turned and walked out the back door. He knew she needed the kitchen empty to finally let the tears fall. The sky didn't turn gray. It turned bruised purple. Like a bad welt, the wind died at 3 in the afternoon. The birds stopped singing. Silence was heavy, suffocating. It tastes like copper and ozone. Storm's coming, Silas said. He was standing the porch, looking west. Ellie stepped out beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. We got the wheat in the lower barn. The roof is patched. They'll stay dry. Silas didn't look away from the horizon. It's not the rough I'm worried about. It's the ground. The rain hit at dusk. It didn't start as a drizzle. It dropped like a wall of lead. The sound of it hitting the tin roof of the porch was deafening. A continuous roar that drowned out everything else. 10 o'clock, the yard was a lake. By midnight, Silas was banging his fist against the kitchen door. He was soaked to the bone, his duster plastered to his massive frame. He didn't have his hat. Water ran down his face in sheets. The creek. Silas yelled over the roar of the rain. It's jumping the banks, heading for the lower barn. If it breaches the doors, the wheat rots. Ellie didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. Caleb, the boy, still limping but fueled by adrenaline, appeared from his room. Grab the bulls, Ellie barked. She threw on William's old waxed canvas coat. Lily, you stay here. The stove burning. Do not open this door unless you hear my voice. The 3 of them plunged into the dark. The night was a screaming, violent thing. The lantern light barely cut 5 feet through the driving rain. They ran toward the lower barn. The creek, normally a docile ribbon of water, was a raging torrent of black mud and snapping branches. The water was already licking at the barn doors. We need a berm, Silas shouted, pointing to a slight rise in the dirt 20 yards away. Dig a trench to divert the flow, pile the mud high on the barn side. Dug. It was brutal, punishing labor. The mud was heavy as wet cement. It sucked at their boots. It clung to the shovels. Every scoop was a battle against gravity and the freezing rain. He dug next to Silas. Her muscles screamed, burned. She couldn't feel her fingers. Caleb worked on her other side, favoring his stitched leg, panting heavily. For 2 hours they fought the river. The water rose. It crested the trench. It pushed against the mud wall they were building. More dirt, Silas roared. It's giving way. Ellie drove her shovel into the muck. She hoisted it up, but the ground beneath her boots gave way. The riverbank sheared off. Slipped. She fell forward, her hands plunging into the freezing, rushing water. Silas dropped his shovel. He lunged. He caught her forearm. His grip was like a steel vise. Ellie scrambled for purchase in the slick mud, her free hand shooting out. She grabbed Silas by the bicep. They froze there, anchored to each other. The rain pounded down on them. The river roared inches from Elia's face. Silas was on his knees in the mud, holding her entire weight, his muscles straining against the pull of the water. Ellie looked up. Dark, through the driving rain, she met his eyes. There was no romance in it. There was no soft lighting. They were covered in filth, freezing and terrified. But in that split second, the world narrowed down to just the two of them. "I got you," Silas yelled over the storm. "I got you," he hauled her up. She scrambled onto the solid mud. They collapsed against the newly built berm, chests heaving. They didn't let go of each other. Ellie's hands were fisted in the wet canvas of his coat. Silas' hand was wrapped around her shoulder. They held on, breathing in the dark. Partners in the dirt, surviving. By dawn, the rain slowed to a drizzle. The berm held. The water was receding. The barn was dry. They walked back to the house in silence, looking like the walking dead. They stripped off their muddy boots on the porch. Lily had hot coffee waiting. They drank it without speaking, too tired to form words. They slept until noon. When Ellie finally walked out onto the porch, the sun was shining. The world smelled washed and new. The terror of the night felt like a bad dream. She saw the horses. 2 men were riding up the muddy driveway, not in a buggy this time. On horse, one of them was Harrison Thorne S. Farrett's lawyer, Elias Reed. The other was a large, unkempt man with a thick beard and a repeater rifle resting across his saddle pommel. Met Bone, the rustler. Silas stepped out of the tack shed. He saw Bone. His posture changed instantly. The casual farmhand vanished. The ranger returned. He walked to the porch, taking his place beside Ellie. Boone reined in his horse. He looked at Silas and grinned. It was an ugly, broken-toothed smile. Well, Boone spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "Look what washed up in the flood. The great Silas Vance, playing house." Silas didn't blink. "You're trespassing, Boone." Again, Reed, the lawyer, nervously cleared his throat. He pulled a folded legal document from his breast pocket. He held it out, though he stayed on his horse. "Mrs. Stanton," Reed said, his voice trembling slightly, "I am serving you with a formal notice of foreclosure." Ellie frowned. "Isn't due until December. Mr. Thorne bought your debt from the regional bank," Reed explained, reading from the paper. "Buried in the original contract your husband signed was a clause. If the debt changes hands, the new creditor has the right to accelerate the note. Notice was mailed to the county clerk 3 days ago." Reed looked up. "You have 30 days, Mrs. Stanton. 30 days to produce $340, or the sheriff will forcefully evict you. 30 days, not 9 weeks. The world tilted beneath Ellie's feet. The floor dropped out. 30 days wants enough time to sell the wheat, transport it, and collect the cash. The Thorne knew it. He had laid a perfect legal trap. "Off this property," Silas said. His voice was dangerously quiet. His hand drifted toward his holster. Boone laughed. He rested his hand on his rifle. "You gonna shoot me, Vance?" Boone taunted. "You gonna gun me down like you did that boy in Abilene?" The air left the yard. Silas froze. His hand stopped an inch from his gun. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. Ellie looked at Silas. She saw the devastation hit him. "What boy?" Ellie asked. The words barely made it past her lips. He leaned over his saddle pommel, locking eyes with Ellie. "You're here, widow," Boone sneered. "Ask the great Texas Ranger why he ain't wearing his badge no more. Ask him about Toby Miller, 17 years old, unarmed, running from a saloon brawl." And Silas Vance put a .45 caliber slug right through the kid's back in the dark. Boone spat again. "He ain't a savior, Mrs. Stanton. Has a child killer hiding in your barn." Boone yanked his reins, turning his horse. Reed followed quickly. They rode back down the muddy drive, leaving the poison hanging in the air. Ellie stood on the porch. Looked at Silas. Silas didn't look back. His eyes were fixed on the ground. His hands were shaking. The ghost he had been out running had finally caught him. He turned, walked to the tack shed, and shut the door. The silence that followed was heavier than the flood. The tack shed was dark. Silas didn't light the lantern. He didn't need the light to pack. His hands moved over the familiar shapes of his life. A wool blanket, a spare shirt, a tin coffee cup. With a great razor, he shoved them into his worn leather saddlebags. The air in the shed was cold, but the cold inside Silas was worse. It was the deep, marrow-freezing chill of a man who had finally stopped running. Boone's words hung in the air, echoing off the pine walls. "Child killer, Toby Miller, 17 years old. A kid caught in the wrong saloon, at the wrong time. When the shooting started, the boy panicked. He ran. Silas blind in the gun smoke in the dark alley. had fired at a running shadow holding what looked like a pistol. A whiskey bottle. The bullet hit Toby square in the back. Silas buckled the left saddlebag. He pulled the strap tight. Too tight. The leather creaked. He had brought his rot to Ellie's farm. That was the truth of it. He thought he could outwork his sins. He thought fixing a fence or harvesting wheat would balance the scales, but a man can't buy his way out of hell with a scythe. Now, because of him, Thorne had used Boone. Thorne had found the pressure point. Silas picked up his gun belt. The Colt felt like a physical weight tying him to the dirt. He slung it over his shoulder. The shed door swung open. The hinges shrieked. A slice of pale, morning light cut across the dirt floor. Ellie stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing her work coat. Her face was drawn, pale, but her eyes were like hammered steel. She looked at the saddlebags. She looked at the gun belt over his shoulder. "Going somewhere?" she asked. Her voice was flat. "Saddling the roan," Silas said. He didn't look her in the eye. He stared at the floorboards. "I'll be off your land by sunrise. You won't have to look at me." "Put the bags down, Silas. You heard what Boone said." "I heard him. Put the bags down." Silas didn't move. His jaw tightened. "It was the truth, Ellie, every ugly word of it. I shot a boy in the back, a boy who hadn't done a damn thing wrong. I don't belong near your kids. I don't belong in a decent house." He stepped toward the door. Ellie didn't move out of the frame. She blocked his path. She was a foot shorter and 100 pounds lighter, but she stood like a brick wall. "Move, Ellie, please no." She stepped inside the shed and pushed the door shut behind her. The light vanished. They stood in the dim gray shadows. "You think leaving fixes this?" Ellie asked. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut straight to the bone. "You think riding off into the territory to freeze and starve makes you a righteous man?" "It makes me gone," Silas rasped. "It removes the stain. It makes you a coward." Silas flinched. The word hit harder than a closed fist. Ellie stepped closer. "You think you're the only one carrying ghosts, Silas? You think my William died an easy death? I watched him drown in his own lungs for 3 weeks. I would have saved him if I had my license, if I had access to the right medicine. I failed him, but I didn't pack a bag. I didn't abandon children to punish myself." Silas closed his eyes. "Not the same." "It is exactly the same." Ellie fired back. "Listen to me. Suffering is not redemption. Punishing yourself doesn't put food on a table. It doesn't fix a broken roof. It doesn't bring that boy back. It's just a place for you to hide." She stepped out. She grabbed the strap of his saddlebag. She didn't pull it, just held on to it. "You want to honor the life you took," she said, the educational weight of her words hanging heavy in the quiet room. "Stand up and do something with the life you have left. Help me save this farm. Help me fight Harrison Thorne. Do not let your guilt be the excuse you use to stop being a good man." Silas opened his eyes. He looked at her hand on his bag. Her knuckles were white. "I don't know how to be a good man anymore," he whispered. "Then you learn by doing the work. Now drop the bags." For a long moment the silence stretched. Then slowly the tension drained from Silas' shoulders. The gun belt slid off his shoulder, hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. The saddlebags followed. Ellie nodded once. He turned and walked out of the shed. 2 hours later the yard was quiet. Splitting logs he swung was at the woodpile, mechanical precision. He wasn't fixed, but he was staying. Up at the house a wagon rolled to a stop. Clara Jenkins climbed down. She was 67. Her back slightly stooped from years of scrubbing Thorne's floors, but her eyes were sharp. She carried a small woven basket. Ellie met her on the porch. "You shouldn't be here if Mr. finds out you visited me." "Harrison Thorne can rot in the devil's outhouse," Clara said sharply. She climbed the steps, her breath puffing in the cold air. "Word gets around, Ellie. I heard about the rustler Boone. I heard what he shouted in your yard." Ellie sighed, crossing her arms against the chill. "It's true, Clara," Silas admitted it. Clara didn't look shocked. She didn't gasp. She reached into her basket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was yellowed, brittle at the edges, newsprint. "My late husband used to subscribe to the Helena papers," Clara said. "Kept a scrapbook of the big events. Range wars, the train robberies. When Boone started shouting about Abilene yesterday, it jogged my memory. I stayed up half the night digging through the attic." She pressed the clipping into Ellie's hand. Ellie unfolded it. It was from the Helena Independent, dated 2 years ago. The headline read, "Former Ranger Pays Widow's Debt." Ellie read the ink. It detailed the aftermath of the shooting in Abilene. It told how Silas Vance had resigned his commission in disgrace. But it didn't end there. It described how Silas had tracked down Toby Miller's mother, a destitute widow facing eviction. article stated that Silas Vance had emptied his bank account, his entire life savings. He paid 6 years of rent on her house. He bought her a sewing machine so she could make a living. He did it through a lawyer, anonymously. He never showed his face. But the lawyer talk the reporter found out. The last paragraph was a quote from Mrs. Miller. "The man who shot my boy didn't mean to. The law cleared him, but his conscience didn't. He gave me everything he had. I don't want his blood. I want him to live a life worthy of the grace I am giving him today." Give him. Ellie stared at the paper, her vision blurred. "He never told you, did he?" Clara asked softly. "No," Ellie whispered. "He thinks he's a monster." Clara patted Ellie's arm. "Good men usually do. That's how you know they aren't. A bad man never loses a wink of sleep over the pain he causes. You take that paper to him, Ellie." Clara turned and walked back to her wagon. Ellie stood on the porch for a long time. She looked at the woodpile. Silas was sweating, swinging the axe, punishing his body because he thought his soul demanded it. She walked down the steps, crossed the yard. Silas saw her coming and stopped. He leaned on the axe handle, breathing hard. Ellie didn't say a word. She held out the clipping. Silas wiped his brow with his sleeve. He took the paper. He recognized the font. He read the last paragraph, the quote from Toby's mother. His breath hitched. The axe handle slipped from his grip. He stared at the yellowed paper, as if it were a ghost. "She forgave me," he said. The words cracked in half. "Did," Ellie said. "2 years ago. You've been serving a sentence," she commuted, Silas. "You paid your debt. It's time to put it down." Silas looked up at her. The tough, silent drifter was gone. His eyes were red. A single tear broke loose, cutting a clean track through the dust on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Now you do," Ellie said. She reached out and touched his arm. Just a light pressure, solid. "We have 30 days, Silas, and I have a plan, but I can't do it alone." Silas folded the paper carefully. He placed it in his pocket right over his heart. He picked up the axe. "Tell me the plan." Ellie didn't wait for the sun. She saddled the mare in the dark. The frost was thick, painting the valley silver. Caleb stood holding the lantern. Silas checked the cinch on the saddle, making sure it was tight. "It's a 2-day ride to Helena," Silas said. He ran his hand down the mare's neck. "The road is rutted. The southern pass, it's longer, but the mud is frozen solid. Less chance of throwing a shoe." Ellie nodded. She wore her warmest wool skirt, heavy boots, and Williams coat. In her saddlebag was her black leather medical case, and a thick stack of papers she had spent the night writing by candlelight. "You watch the kids," Ellie said to Silas, "and y'all watch Thorn. Thorn won't step foot on this dirt while I'm breathing," Silas promised. Ellie pulled herself up into the saddle. She looked down at Caleb. "You listen to Silas, you don't argue." "Yes, ma." She spurred the mare. The horse trotted down the drive, its breath plumbing in the icy air. She was riding into the belly of the beast, the territory capital, a place where the men in wool suits made the rules. But Ellie wasn't going to beg for a license this time. Begging was for victims. She was going to negotiate. The medical board of Helena sat in a mahogany-paneled room. 5 men, expensive cigars, heavy pocket watches. Dr. Eris Finch, the board president, adjusted his spectacles as Ellie walked in. She didn't wait to be invited. She walked to the center of the long table. She dropped her leather case on the polished wood. "Mrs. Stanton," Finch said, clearing his throat, "we did not have you on the docket if this is regarding your previous application. I am not here to apply for a standard license." "Dr. Finch," Ellie interrupted. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried the acoustics of the room perfectly. She opened her bag. She pulled out the papers. She handed a copy to each man. "I am offering a solution to a problem you are currently ignoring," Ellie said. Finch looked at the paper. "A mobile clinic? The ranchers in the Oakhaven Valley are a 2-day ride from this office," Ellie said. "When a man takes an axe to the leg or a woman goes into a breached labor, they bleed out before they reach your pristine waiting rooms. You are losing citizens. You are losing taxpayers." The men shifted in their leather chairs. "Proposing a circuit practice," Ellie continued, leaning her palms on the table. "I will ride the valley. I will treat the wounds, deliver the babies, and set the bones. I will report my case files to this board monthly. In exchange, you will grant me a provisional practitioner's certificate, not a full license, a certificate of necessity. It is highly irregular," a man on the left muttered. "A woman riding alone. The liability. The liability is dead farmers." Ellie shot back. The educational weight of her words hit them square. "Capability doesn't have a gender, gentlemen. It has a pulse. I saved my son's leg 3 days ago with carbolic acid and silk. How many men in this room have successfully tied off a femoral artery in the dirt silence? Them had. A certificate of necessity gives me a legal trade, Ellie said. It gives me an independent income. It means my farm does not rely solely on the grace of the bank. Dr. Finch took off his glasses. He looked at the woman standing before him. Mud on her boots, dust on her coat, unflinching. You are a formidable woman, Mrs. Stanton. I am a desperate mother. Dr. Finch and desperate mothers move mountains. I need your answer before I leave this room. While Ellie stood her ground in Helena, Harrison Thorne was making his move in Oakhaven. Come to the farm, he went to the town hall. It was Wednesday night. The hall was packed. Farmers, shopkeepers, ranchers. Thorne stood at the front, looking benevolent and deeply concerned. Sheriff Amos Dalton stood near the door, his arms crossed, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Silas walked in through the back doors just as Thorne began to speak. He leaned against the back wall, quiet as a shadow. We are a community built on order, Thorne was saying, his voice resonating through the room. An order requires following the law. Mrs. Stanton is a good woman, but she is drowning. The bank has accelerated her debt, as is our legal right. Her suffer through the winter, dragging her children into poverty, is a sin. We must encourage her to sell. He painted the eviction as an act of mercy. It was a masterclass in manipulation. A few farmers nodded. It was easier to agree with the bank than to fight it. Silas pushed off the wall. He walked down the center aisle. His boots echoed on the hardwood floor. The murmurs died down. The crowd parted. Silas stopped 10 feet from Thorne. You talk a lot about the law, Mr. Thorne, Silas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room. It's a town meeting, Vance, Thorne sneered. Drifters don't have a vote. I don't need a vote. I just need to read. Silas pulled a small blue-bound book from his duster pocket, the revised statutes of the Montana Territory. He opened it to a dog-eared page. Section 4, paragraph 12, Silas read aloud, his voice steady, regarding the transfer and acceleration of agricultural debt. A creditor may accelerate a note upon transfer only if the original debtor is provided a written notice of intent, 60 days prior to the enforcement of the acceleration. Silas snapped the book shut. He looked at the crowd, then he looked at Thorne. You gave Mrs. Stanton 30 days, Silas stated. You served her the notice on Monday. The law says she has 60. Means your foreclosure notice is invalid. Null and void. The original note stands. December 15th. Thorne's face flushed dark red. That is a technicality. I own the debt. I make the rules. No, a voice said from the back of the room. Every head turned. Sheriff Amos Dalton walked forward. He uncrossed his arms. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had swallowed his pride for 10 years and finally decided to throw it up. It's not a technicality, Harrison, Dalton said. His voice was remarkably calm. It's the law. Liz is right. Thorne stared at the sheriff, aghast. Amos, you work for this town. You know who pays your salary. The taxpayers pay my salary, Dalton replied, the subtext of his action echoing loudly. A man breaking his complicity. You just pay for my whiskey and I'm done drinking. If you send your men to the Stanton farm before December 15th, I will arrest them for trespassing. And if you try to evict that widow before the legal date, I will arrest you. The room erupted. Whispers turned to shouts. The spell was broken. The town saw Thorne not as a savior, but as a predator who had just been defanged. Silas looked at Dalton. Dalton tipped his hat. Full acknowledgement this time. Silas turned and walked out the door into the crisp night air. He had bought Ellie her time. Ellie rode back into the yard late Friday afternoon. Silas was waiting by the porch. Caleb ran out to take the mare's reins. Ellie slid down from the saddle. She was exhausted. Her face was covered in trail dust, but as she looked at Silas, her eyes were shining. She reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a thick piece of parchment. It bore the heavy gold wax seal of the Montana Territory Medical Board, Provisional Practitioner's Certificate. Got it, she breathed. $3 a visit. I have 4 appointments lined up next week in the Northern Ridge. Silas smiled, a real, genuine smile. It changed his entire face, erasing 10 years of hard living. And you? Ellie asked. Did Thorne try anything? Thorne called a meeting, Silas said softly. Tried to rally the town, but we read some law together. You have until December 15th, Ellie. Not a day sooner. Sheriff Dalton guaranteed it. Ellie stared at him. The relief hit her so hard her knees wobbled. Silas reached out and caught her elbow, steadying her. Stood in the yard, the sun setting behind them, painting the farm in strokes of gold and fire. The debt was still there. The winter was still coming, but the trap was broken. Ellie looked down at the hand holding her arm. Then she looked up at the man who had stayed. "We're going to make it," she said. Silas nodded. "Yes, ma'am, we are." December 15th arrived. It brought the snow. It wasn't a blizzard, just fat, wet flakes that drifted down slow and quiet. Covering the mud of Oakhaven in a clean white blanket, Ellie stood on the boardwalk outside the territorial bank. Took a deep breath. The air tasted like pine and wood smoke. Silas stood beside her. He didn't stand in front of her to lead the way. He didn't stand behind her like a guard. He stood right at her shoulder. "Equal ground. Ready?" he asked. "I've been ready. Since August," Ellie said. She pushed the heavy oak door open. The bank was warm. It smelled of polished brass and stale cigar smoke. Harrison Thorne wasn't there. A young clerk stood behind the teller's cage, looking nervous. Thorne had retreated to his office in Helena. A defeated man rarely sticks around to watch the person who beat him take their victory. His absence was a loud, hollow thing. It proved that bullies only like a fight when the other side doesn't punch back. Ellie walked to the brass cage. She set a heavy canvas sack on the mahogany counter. It hit the wood with a solid, undeniable thud. "Good morning," Ellie said. Her voice didn't shake. "I am here to clear the note on the Stanton farm." The clerk swallowed hard. He opened the ledger. $340, Mrs. Stanton, plus $2 in processing fees. Ellie untied the string. Began stacking the money. First came the crop money, $165 crinkled bills and heavy silver from the miller. Next came a leather pouch. Still his wages, the money he had refused to take, saved up week by week, $87. He hadn't told her about it. He gave it to Caleb the night before, and Caleb gave it to her. Then came the rest, $8 in pennies, nickels and worn greenbacks. It was town money. 2 days ago, Clara Jenkins had walked into the mercantile. Hadn't bought anything. She just stood by the Cracker Barrel and told the truth. She told the men playing checkers about Ellie's medical license. She told them about Thorne's illegal 30-day notice. She told them how a drifter had stepped in when the town had looked away. By nightfall, a coffee tin had appeared on Ellie's porch. It was filled with small donations, the silent apologies of a community that had finally woken up. "Count it." Ellie told the clerk. He counted. His hands shook slightly. He stacked the coins. He tallied the bills. He dipped his pen in the inkwell. "In full," the clerk said. He stamped the deed. He slid the heavy parchment across the counter. Ellie picked it up. She didn't cry. She just folded it carefully and slid it into her coat pocket. The weight she had been carrying for 8 months vanished. Her shoulders dropped. She turned and walked out the door. Silas followed. They stepped out onto the boardwalk. A crowd had gathered. Not a mob, just folks. The blacksmith, the baker, some farmers from the lower valley. Clara Jenkins stood at the front. She wore a heavy wool shawl against the snow. She stepped up to Ellie and took her rough, calloused hands. Clara turned to look at the crowd. "We stayed quietly complicit in this town for a long time," Clara said. Her voice was thin with age, but it carried like a bell. "We watched Harrison Thorne push people out, and we looked at our boots because we were afraid. But silence never bought freedom for anyone. It just pays the rent for the devil." Clara looked back at Ellie. Her eyes were bright. "You didn't just redeem your land today, Ellie. Refusing to bow, you redeemed the conscience of this town. You remind us what it means to be neighbors." Ellie squeezed Clara's hands. She looked out at the faces. Sheriff Dalton was there, tipping his hat. They had won. Not with guns, not with violence. With the slow, grinding power of refusing to quit. There was no church wedding. Ellie and Silas didn't need a preacher to tell them what they meant to each other. They didn't need a congregation. They knew who they were. That evening, the snow stopped. The sky cleared, revealing a sea of cold, brilliant stars. Stood on the back porch of the farmhouse, just the two of them, with Caleb and Lily standing by the door. Clara was there, holding a lantern. Silas didn't wear a suit. He wore his clean work shirt. Ellie wore her everyday dress. They faced each other. Silas reached out and took both of her hands. "I don't have grand words," Silas said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. "I came here a broken man. I came here looking for a place to hide from my own guilt. You didn't let me. You made me look at the light." He swallowed hard. "I don't promise perfect, Ellie. I promise to stay. I promise to stand beside you, not in front of you. I promise that when the wind blows hard, I'll be the wall you can lean on and I'll trust you to be mine." Ellie looked up at him. Her gray eyes were shining. "I don't need a savior, Silas." Ellie sat softly, the educational weight of her words carrying the core truth of their bond. "I never did. The world tells women we need a man to lead us. But what we need is a partner to walk with us. A marriage shouldn't be an ownership, it should be a choice. I choose you for the hard days. For the good days, with my eyes wide open, they didn't exchange rings. Didn't have the money for gold. Instead, Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out the blue-bound book, the revised statutes of the Montana Territory, the book that had saved the farm. He placed it in her hands. Ellie smiled. It was the best ring she could have asked for. She leaned up. He leaned down. They kissed. It wasn't the frantic, desperate kiss of a dime novel. It was slow, deep. Quiet sealing of a promise made in dirt and sweat. Caleb grinned in the shadows. Lily clapped her hands. The wind blew across the porch. But for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel cold. Spring 1,882.3 years is a long time on the frontier. It is enough time for a sapling to take root, enough time for a scar to turn white and stop aching when it rains. The valley was green. The Sweetwater Creek babbled, full of snowmelt. Ellie Stanton Vance rode her mare down the driveway. She wore a split riding skirt, practical, ignoring the scandalized whispers of the older generation. Slung across her saddle horn was a brown leather bag. Turned into the leather were the words E. Vance, medical practitioner. She had just returned from the northern ridge, a difficult breech birth. It took 14 hours, but the mother was sleeping and the baby was breathing. Ellie was exhausted, her hair wild from the wind, but her soul was entirely at peace. She rode into the yard. Down by the corral, Silas and Caleb were working. Caleb was 17 now. He had grown 3 inches, his shoulders broadening out. He swung a hammer, driving a nail into a fresh pine rail. Silas stood beside him, holding the wood steady. He paused. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. He looked at Silas. Silas, the boy said. He didn't call him Pa. Silas had never asked him to. William was his father. Silas was something else, something just as permanent. You ever miss the trail, the ranging? Silas looked out over the green wheat rippling in the breeze. He looked at the barn he had roofed. He looked at the porch. No, Silas said, simply. Because a man only runs when he doesn't have a place to stand, Silas said. Added the wooden rail. This is my home, Caleb. You only need to search the horizon when you haven't found what's right in front of you. Caleb nodded, satisfied. He raised the hammer again. Ellie smiled. She dismounted and walked toward the porch. Lily was sitting on the top step. She was 11. Her knees were pulled up to her chest and a book rested on them. It was Silas' old copy of Meditations. She had a pencil behind her ear, making notes in the margins. Mama, Lily said, looking up. Did you save the baby? I did, sweetheart, a little boy. Good, Lily said, tapping her pencil against the book. Reading about anatomy. When I grow up, I'm going to be a surgeon like you. Only going to have a clinic right here in town. Ellie stopped. She looked at her daughter. She didn't tell her it was impossible. She didn't tell her the world was too hard for women. Then you will, Ellie said firmly. And if the board tells you no, you just keep standing there until they say yes. Capability doesn't ask for permission, Lily. Ellie walked past her daughter and opened the door to the kitchen. She set her medical bag on the table. She poured a cup of water from the pump and stood by the window, looking out at her family. People in town sometimes asked her if she had any regrets, if she wished life hadn't been so hard. Wished the bank hadn't come calling or the rustlers hadn't struck. She always gave them the same polite smile and said she was fine. But standing there watching her son build a fence with the man she loved, and her daughter planning to conquer the world on the front steps, Ellie knew the truth. Life wasn't meaningful because it was easy. It was meaningful because of what grew in the dirt after the storm. None of this was luck. It was the result of choices. Her choice to fight, Silas' choice to speak. Love, she realized, was not fate. It wasn't a magic spell that fell from the fixed, broken people. Love was an action. It was fixing a fence without being asked. Standing in the freezing mud holding a rope, it was looking at a person's darkest ghost and deciding not to run away. Love was a choice you made every single day. Ellie took a sip of her water. The sun broke over the roof of the barn. Washing the kitchen in warm golden light, she set the cup down. She had work to do, and for the first time in her life, she had exactly everything she needed to do it. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
As the golden spring light settles over the Stanton Vance farm, and the Sweetwater Creek runs full through the valley, this story leaves us with a truth as steady as the Montana earth itself. A life is not saved by luck alone, but by the choices people make when everything is at stake. Eleanor Stanton began this journey as a widow standing in an empty barn, staring at the loss of the one cow that kept her children fed, her farm alive, and her hope from breaking completely. The world around her told her to surrender, to sell her land, to accept that a woman alone had no right to stand against bankers, laws, and men who confused power with righteousness. But Ellie refused to let hardship define her worth. She proved that dignity is not something granted by a banknote, a marriage certificate, or a town's approval. Dignity is the quiet fire that keeps a person standing when the road has turned steep and cold. Silas Vance, too, was a man carrying ghosts, convinced that one terrible mistake had made him unworthy of peace. Yet through Ellie he learned that suffering is not redemption, and running is not healing. A good life is not built by punishing yourself forever. It is built by choosing, day after day, to do something worthy with the life you still have. Together, Ellie and Silas show us that love is not rescue. It is not ownership. It is not one person leading while the other follows. Love is action. It is fixing a fence without being asked. It is standing in floodwater with both hands in the mud. It is telling the truth when silence would be easier. It is looking at someone's darkest shame and choosing not to run away. Ellie's medical gift reminds us that capability does not ask permission. A woman's hands can heal, build, defend, and lead, whether or not the world is willing to give her the title she deserves. And through Caleb and Lily, we see the future being changed by example. A boy learning that manhood is not brute force, and a girl learning that no board, no law, and no narrow-minded voice has the right to bury her calling. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this story is that communities are not redeemed by comfort, but by courage. Clara spoke. The sheriff changed. The town woke up, and one widow's refusal to bow reminded everyone what it meant to be neighbors. In the end, the farm was not saved by one grand miracle, but by many small acts of honor stitched together. Kindness, labor, truth, forgiveness, and the stubborn decision to keep standing. Life will always bring storms. It will bring loss, debt, fear, and ghosts from the past. But after the storm, something can still grow in the dirt if we have the courage to plant it. Ellie and Silas did not find an easy life. They found a meaningful one, and that is the real victory. Not a perfect ending, but a chosen life, built with honest hands, shared burdens, and love strong enough to stay.